Okay, we're connected and we're ready to start. Just get right into it. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, so this time I'm going to speak about Karuna, the second Brahmavihara. Last week we did Metta. We could say that Karuna and Mudita are both variations of Metta, or specialist applications of, or special applications of Metta. Metta is the general feeling of well-wishing, benevolence, and Karuna is the focusing on the suffering aspect of beings and raising the earnest wish, may this being and all beings be released from their suffering. May their suffering come to an end. As with Metta, let's look at the translation first. Karuna is always translated as compassion, and that's not bad. It's definitely the closest English word, but I think it's still slightly misleading because the English word compassion comes from Latin roots that means to suffer with. So when one has compassion in the common meaning of the word in English, there's often a sense of empathetic suffering. You see someone in pain and you feel bad because of it. You feel bad for them. This is not really correct for Karuna. If you are practicing Karuna, the impetus is to make an end of suffering. May this being suffering cease. So you don't want to increase your own suffering. You do not want to bring up a vicarious suffering. If you think about it, it makes sense. You don't want to increase the total amount of suffering in the world. Somebody's already suffering, and then if you suffer vicariously, then there's more suffering in the world, not less. This doesn't imply that you're cold-hearted. It's a strong empathetic wish that the beings be released from suffering. Now, we can look at compassion or karuna from two different contexts. There's the context of a formal meditation and the context of practicing karuna as part of your way of relating to the world. So let's talk about it as a meditation first. We dealt with using metta as a basis for meditation last time, and this is done very much the same way, except that the feeling that is brought up is different. It's similar, but it's a shade different. It's not a benevolent, may all beings be well and happy. It's may all beings be released from suffering. So we tend to focus on the suffering of beings when we're doing karuna meditation. If you're doing it in terms of individuals and you go through the list, which is the same as metta, you begin with the teacher, then your parents if they're still alive, then a dear friend, a neutral person, and an enemy. Begin with yourself. You begin with yourself first. You establish this, may I be released from suffering. And then you go through the list. And you would focus on the aspect of suffering. So when you're choosing an individual for the list, uh, you can bias it in terms of looking for someone who is in a bad way right now and needs, could use some compassion. Uh, Likewise, when you do it as general pervasion, you're starting with yourself and then going outwards and increasing circles. May all the beings in this house, in this township, in this province, in this continent, in the world, in the universe, may they all be released from suffering. Then you are looking at the suffering aspect of beings. All beings in samsara have some degree of suffering. This is dukkha. This is the law of dukkha. But obviously, it's not evenly distributed, let us say. So some beings suffer a great deal, and some beings' suffering is very subtle and hard to notice. And beings suffer for all kinds of reasons, from pains in the body to mental distress to loss of loved ones and so on. And all these sufferings are the proper category for Karuna. And to re-emphasize the point, if it makes you feel sad, then you're not doing it correctly. You're missing it slightly. You need to be able to find that kind of equanimity behind Karuna, that there's a wish for beings not to suffer, but it doesn't increase your own suffering. So the far enemy of suffering is cruelty, which is the obviously the direct opposite. You wish that beings have more suffering. That wish is the exact opposite of Karuna. And the near enemy is pity. The English word pity, not the Pali piti as rapture, but the English word pity, which is that point I'm repeatedly making is you don't want to bring up a kind of maudlin sadness with the Karuna. So developing Karuna as a meditation is a good basis, but it should be part of your basic mental environment all the time. The Buddha said that the wise person always dwells in the Brahmaviharas. So one of those four is a state that's appropriate at any time. And we should be guided by Karuna in our dealings with others. Karuna is one of the supreme qualities of the Buddha. The Buddha is perfect in wisdom and compassion. And this is important. Like for putting Karuna into practice, living by Karuna, it's very important that it's balanced or paired or fortified with wisdom. Because at a lower level, the two seem to have an opposite trajectory, but in the end, in the state of perfection, they come together. The Buddha, Sammasambuddha, perfect in wisdom and compassion. So there's no differentiation at the highest level between the two. Wisdom leads us to see the emptiness of things, and there is a danger if there's no compassion involved in the mind, and that the wisdom can become very cold and cynical and even hard-edged. uh, One example of this misuse of the wisdom teachings, a historical example, uh, are the samurai in Japan during the 30s and 40s, when Japan was at war in China. Uh, Many of the soldiers adopted a samurai ethic and claimed that they were following Zen teachings. And they would make statements like, if I cut off a man's head, I'm not doing anything uh, other than passing empty atoms through empty atoms. There's no harm, no blame. Now, from a very strictly narrow technical perspective, that's true. That's all that's happening. It's empty atoms passing through empty atoms. But obviously, that's an inhuman attitude, and what's missing is that sense of compassion. Yes, uh, there is no such so there is no real substantial person, but there is suffering, and the compassionate person will act in the world to relieve suffering and not to increase it. Now, on the other hand, if a person has compassion but no wisdom, uh, they're also likely to blunder into increasing the suffering in the world. And we see this in many instances in our own lives and in things we observe in the world, that people feel motivated to try and help when they see something wrong, they see somebody suffering or some injustice. They want to jump in and try and help. And often, if that's done without any wisdom, that matters are only made worse. It's very important that if you take actions in the world that are motivated by compassion, that you guide that with wisdom. So the first question for wisdom to answer is there anything I can actually do to relieve this instance of suffering? And many times there's not. The suffering is real, your compassion is real, but there's nothing you can do about it. That doesn't mean you're uncompassionate. Karuna should still be present in the mind, but in that case, doesn't it doesn't have to be expressed in the body. However, if in some instances you can help, you can do something, and then you need to examine what is the most skillful way for me to intervene in this situation. It's a very tricky balancing act, and it's a important life skill. Is learning to do that dance between wisdom and compassion. The truly wise and compassionate person can do a lot of good in the world, but if one side is missing, then um, it, you're more likely to do harm than good. So karuna is a very important quality to be developed, and as I said, it's one of the supreme qualities of the Buddha. So it gets a special mention in that regard. That, um, and it's one of the hallmarks of awakened or enlightened mind, that person will be very compassionate. But they'll also be wise and skillful. And it has that uh, difference from metta in that it's a special development. It focuses on one aspect. It focuses on the suffering of beings, whereas metta is more general. And when we next week we'll talk about mudita, which is um, again a special development that focuses on the happiness or well-being of beings. So I think I'll leave it there as an introduction to Karuna, and I'm happy that was kind of short, but I covered most of the ground last week. So um, we'll take some questions. Metta can only lead to first jhana because it requires Vitaka Vichara. However, other Brahmaviharas can lead to higher jhana, but also require Vitaka Vichara. I don't believe that the other jhanas can lead beyond first jhana. The other Brahmaviharas can lead beyond the first jhana. I know there's some um, contradictions there in the Visuddhimagga, but in my opinion, I think that the Brahmaviharas are basically limited to first jhana. Have you seen a doctor about that cough? No, I haven't. I'm old. That's all it is. Since Brahmaviharas are feeling meditation, I can feel metta eventually. The other Brahmaviharas make me feel nothing. Are these other Brahmaviharas supposed to be more advanced or something? Um, they may be a little bit more difficult at first. I don't think they're really so much. They may be. You may consider them more advanced in a way, in that if one develops metta first, which is the usual course, then you can find the other feelings perhaps a little easier. Uh, I would just stick with it and try and see if you can find it. Modern scholarship seems to think the Second Council is what led to the first split due to dispute in Vinaya, and the Staviras were trying to add new rules to the more strict. Uh, since other sources cite only having 150 rules, and the Mahadeva stuff was a confusion of a later event that led to a split in Mahasangika in the formation of the Chaitaka set. The association with Mahayana is that some Mahasamgika branches were the first to accept Mahayana suttas, but this also eventually happened in most of the Virasada school. What are your thoughts about the whole thing? That's a very complex topic to go into. I have done a whole series of videos on early Buddhist history, and I dealt with many of these topics. Um, the Second Council, uh, in the interesting thing, I'll just say something about Second Council. The interesting thing about Second Council is that we have two accounts of the Second Council, and they're quite radically different. The one that's probably, or certainly much better known, is the one in the Theravada, which is in Pali, in I believe it's the Chulawaga. It's in one of the Vinaya books. I'm pretty sure it's the Chulawaga. And that makes the split entirely about Vinaya. The dispute was that there were some monks who wanted to relax the Vinaya. They kind of made up their own allowances that would relax many of the rules. And the Staviravadas that were the traditionalists who resisted that. The other account we have survives only in, as far as I know, in Tibetan translation. And it tells the story of the Second Council as being the dispute being entirely about doctrine. And the question uh, the question was, well, there were a number of disputed points, but the main question was on the status of an arahant as compared to a Buddha. And Vinaya doesn't even come into that account. So they're probably the two accounts probably come from the two different schools that split as a result of the Second Council and its aftermath. The split didn't actually occur at the Second Council, but some years later. But the um, the process began with Second Council. Does one in real sense enter the realm form of the Brahmaviharas, or is that just metaphorical? Um, well, that's a matter of opinions, but I tend to believe that is a real existent realm that one can be reborn into, the Brahma realms. Do you have any recommendations for a practice when you're feeling unwell? My normal practice of anapanasati doesn't go very well when fatigued and my nose is stuffed up. Yeah, that's true. I know that when you're stuffed and your breathing is difficult, it's not so easy to do anapana. At least at the nose tip, you can try. If you want to stay with anapana, you can try watching the breath at the abdomen. And I'll also say this about developing samatha meditation. If you are suffering from illness or injury, and if you're good at developing samadhi, it acts as a kind of a pain relief in a way because you can sort of abstract yourself from the body, and you're kind of away from the stress of the body and remaining in a more mental state, an inner state, let's say. Does it need a special kind of concentration for jhana, or is the concentration just more dense? I think the best way to think of it is not more dense, but more still or more quiet. That you're trying to develop samadhi to a deeper and deeper degree, and at some point we can call that jhana. Um, and the key factor is ekagata, which is the unification of mind. That the mind has only one object. But the key point for practice is that's not attained by forcing the mind onto the object or narrowing the mind onto the object, but filling the mind, a vast, spacious mind, filling it with a single object. So the stillness is the key factor. Vishnavada differed from Sarvastivada due to rejecting Einsteinian time. Uh, and all Abhidhammas are considered a Sarvastivada branch. Why is this the case? Well, yeah, that was the split between at the third council between the Vibhajavadins, who eventually became Theravada, and the Sarvastivada. I don't know, calling it Einsteinian time. I see where you're coming from with that, but that's a bit of a stretch. Um, I mean, they weren't thinking in terms of modern physics of space time, but the debate was over whether past, present, and future are all real. And the Vibhajavadins took the view that only the present is real. The Sarvastivadins that all three times are real. How important with Karuna to visualize the suffering of others to develop compassion? Well, to some degree. I mean, I think that could easily be taken too far. You don't want to be uh, constantly visualizing or imagining beings suffering from horrible diseases or something, but just to kind of be aware beings suffer and wish they're released from that suffering. In Samyutta Nikaya 12:15, Buddha defines right view as when you see the origin of the world with right understanding, and you won't have the root of non-existence. And when you see the cessation with right understanding, you won't have the notion of existence. Can you explain what this means? Yeah, the two false views, or one way of classifying false views is uh, the view that things exist in actuality is kind of the atiwada, and then the other extreme view is that nihilistic view that nothing exists, the natiwada, and the middle path between them sees the falsity in both. And if you and this relates very directly to experience in meditation. If you see the arising of dhammas, but you miss the ceasing, then you'll tend to fall into substantial view, materialist view, and or eternalist view. You see things as substantially real and persisting. But if you see the ending of dhammas, but not the arising, then you'll fall into a nihilistic uh, view of nothing real, natiwada. It seems to me that ego attachments are obstacles to wisdom, otherwise it'll arise almost naturally. What are the other obstacles to wisdom? Um, well, it's basically the defilements. You cite ego attachments, but also I would say fear. Fear is a big one. Aversion, sensual desire. Um, you know these all boil down to the three roots of ignorance, um, craving, and ill will. If pity becomes too strong in second jhana, how does one pacify it to move to third jhana? Um, I don't think you can really force it. It becomes a kind of a natural development that the PT becomes more and more subtle and it fades into sukha. The kind of thrilling, ecstatic aspect begins to seem coarse and it begins to calm and become less erratic and more steady, and that kind of fades into sukha. In my opinion, like I'll say this about the jhanas. If you read enough and or listen to enough teachers, you'll find all kinds of different takes on the jhana. You can become very confused. I'll just say, in my opinion, the best way to look at it is to see the jhanas as a continuum, not as discrete, clearly defined states. So the movement from ordinary consciousness to first fades into first jhana, fades into second jhana and third jhana. And the key between second and third jhana is the movement away from piti and into sukha. And I think that's a gradual movement. It's not a sudden shift. And you don't have to try and suppress the sukha. You just have to try and sublimate it. Just encourage it to become more peaceful. Is it okay to be irritated with how many people are just living blindly, chasing after next shiny objects? No, it's not. It's not okay to allow yourself to be irritated. I mean, you're falling into defilement yourself, being irritated at other people's defilements. It's not skillful. Is the Israel-Palestine conflict an example of feeling compassion but being unable to do anything, at least for the average person? Yes, I would say that foreign wars in general, there's horrible suffering is unleashed on people in these situations, but there's really uh, little or nothing we can do. If we live in a ostensible or so-called democracy, we can have, and we're citizens of the country, we can have some influence on the decisions of our government in our own country, but we can't really do anything about overseas. I would encourage having compassion for people on all sides of these disputes. Have you have any thoughts about the relationship between karma and what Jung called synchronicity? Could karma be an explanation or at least a clarification? Yeah, I think there's a strong there's a strong relationship there. That we have the karma for certain things; they express themselves as patterns in the life, and you see these people call them coincidences. There's actually no such thing as a coincidence or a random event. It's all a result of cause and effect. And when we can't clearly see the cause and effect, we can call it a random or a coincidence. But if we take into account the mind and karma, then things begin to make more sense. In the suttas, Buddha says, luminous is the mind, but it's hidden due to defilement. What is this referring to? It's referring to the intrinsic nature of chitta, or the knowing mind, is just pure awareness. Um, and that's the Thai forest way of practice is to try and find that and let that be unobstructed. I like the image you see in Tibetan Buddhism of the blue sky mind. It's an analogy to understand the nature of mind. The sky is always blue and luminous, but on a cloudy day you don't see that. You just see the clouds, the dark, heavy clouds. They're like the defilements, obscuring the underlying nature of the mind. Baba says, thank you. I agree on how easy it is to be confused with all the discussions about jhana. Yeah, that's something that's quite evident. In the one field in Buddhist discourse that you'll find the most sort of novelty takes and different interpretations and ways of explaining is in the whole field of jhanas. Uh, I would encourage you not to become too twisted up with that, and don't try and figure out who's right and who's wrong. And the best is just to try and keep it simple. That all you're really trying to do is to pacify the mind, clear the mind, and still the mind. And if you doing that, you won't do anything wrong. I feel that metta means friendly feeling. Yes, that's good. Friendliness or benevolence. Uh, you often equated emptiness with no self and no self with insubstantiality. Can you explain what substantiality means and why this would not apply to nibbana? Substantiality is, I use that term to try and get a handle on the